Statistical functions. Probably not everybody's favorite functions. It's statistics, but some of these functions are a lot less statistically oriented than you might think. Beginning with the count, COUNTIF, and COUNTIFS functions, which enables you to count records based on criteria that you establish. Moving to the COUNTA function, which allows you to count non-blank cells, followed by the COUNTBLANK function that allows you to count blank cells. And then we're going to take a look at the average, AVERAGEIF, and AVERAGEIFS functions, which allows you to average a series of numbers or values, and then also average a series of numbers or values that fit an established criteria. And since we're covering the mean or the average, we're also going to look at the median and the mode, which is the value that's in the middle and the value that's most common in a data set. And finally, we'll cover the max and min function that enables you to find the maximum value and the minimum value in a range of numbers. So, statistical functions. There's basically two things we can do with the count and the COUNTIF, COUNTIFS functions. One is to use the count function to count how many numbers or values there are in a list of arguments or in a reference range. The second thing is to count how many non-blank cells that meet some criteria or that meet multiple criteria, which you would use the COUNTIF and the COUNTIFS function for. So to begin, we're going to use the count function to count how many numbers or values there are in a given range. And I have some data set up where the values or numbers are blue filled, the text is green filled, and the blank cells are gray filled. There's a total of 12 data points, and we're going to use the count function to return the number of numbers that there are in that range, or values. And I keep stressing that it's numbers or values because the arguments are defined to be values, and the description on the count function references numbers, which is a bit confusing, at least inconsistent, because this function will count dates, which really isn't a number, but it is a value. So going down, selecting cell F30, equal count, and I can select the values independent of one another, comma, or I can select an entire range, and I obviously could have selected the entire range and made that the first and only argument. Close the parentheses, Control Enter, my answer is 7. So the COUNTIF function, selecting cell I34, tabbing the COUNTIF function into the cell, has two arguments. I first select a range, comma, and then establish the criteria. And since the criteria is a text reference, it's got to be in quotes, closing the parentheses, Control Enter. I have 3 records in that range that has the text caps in it. And of course, we could have done something different other than hard coding this reference. I could count how many mittens are in that text string, Control Enter. There's 5 records that contain the word mittens. And if you need to build a function that has more than one criteria that's referenced, you can use the COUNTIFS function. The COUNTIFS function has you select a criteria range and then define a criteria for that range. I'm going to select the dates, comma, and I want everything that's on the 2nd of January, comma, and optionally you can select a second criteria range, which is going to be our product, comma, and the criteria for that range is going to be mittens, comma, and another optional criteria range is defined to be the sales quantity, comma, and we'll select the value that's in K31 or the number 10 as that criteria. Closing the parentheses, Control Enter, and the COUNTIFS returns a count of 3 records that satisfy the criteria. They are right here. And obviously, if any one of those 3 criteria is not met, the COUNTIFS function will not count it. So if I change 10 to 9 on one of those records, the COUNTIFS returns a count of 2. And since we didn't hard code those references in the COUNTIFS function, instead we referenced the values in other cells, I can change the values in those cells and have the COUNTIFS function count how many records that satisfies the new criteria that I'm defining by changing the values in those cells. We have yet two more ways, standard ways at least, to use statistical functions to count the records in a cell. The count A function counts the number of cells that are not empty, I guess, which is another way of counting non-blank cells. And we have the count blank function, which counts the number of blank cells. So once again, we have the data that we used in the prior example, and we should have 10 non-blank cells. And since we have a total of 12 records, we should have 2 blank cells. These particular count functions can be useful to get some statistics on your data. If you have a column of information and none of the cells should be blank, you can use the count blank function to find out whether that's true or not. Or if you know how many records that you should have, you can use the count A function to make sure that you don't have any blank cells. So the statistical functions average, average if, and average if s are just like, basically in structure, the count if, and the count if s. The average function returns the average or the arithmetic mean of the arguments. The average if returns the arithmetic mean for the arguments that meet a given criteria, and the average if s returns the mean for multiple criteria. So I'm going to set up an average function the easy way by selecting the range of cells I want to average, and then going to the auto sum, and instead of summing, left-clicking average. And I've inserted an average function instead of a sum function, which might be a little bit easier and quicker than typing out the word average, at least for me. The average if function allows us to average a range of values that meet a certain criteria. Arrowing down twice, tabbing to get it into the cell, I want to average the same data, comma, but I want to establish a criteria to average only the data points, and I'll have to put this in quotes, that are greater than 20. Closing the parentheses, Control Enter. The average is 22.4. And just to check that against the average function right above, we can set the criteria to be greater than 0, and I should get the same number. Control Enter, and I do. The average if s function, arrowing down, tabbing, I'm going to use to average the same range of numbers. And this time I can set up some multiple criteria. I can average the sales for the caps, comma, on a given day, comma, and this again will have to be in quotes because even though the dates are numbers, they're values, what this function is looking for is what's displayed in the cell, which needs to be put in the same way that it's displayed, in quotes, close the parentheses, Control Enter, and the average is 18 because there's only one record that satisfies that criteria. And since we talked about the mean or the average, we're also going to cover the median and the mode. The median is the number that's in the center of the range of numbers, and the mode returns the most common value in the data set. So I've got 7 numbers here. The median is fairly obvious. It's 50. So I'm going to put a median function and select that range of numbers and enter, and the result is 50. The median function doesn't return 50 because 50 is the data point that's in the center of the 7 numbers. It returns a data point because it's arithmetically in the center. So I can move the value 50 up here and change that to 100, and the answer is still 50. And it doesn't matter whether the numbers above and below are extremely large or extremely small, or that they have to even be the same numbers. As long as, in this case, 50 is in the center point, and there are 3 numbers that are higher than 50 and 3 numbers that are lower than 50, the median function will return 50 as the median. So that's the median. The mode returns the most common value in the range. Currently, that should either be 100 or 1. And it's returning 100 because it's the value that it identified first. So if there's a tie in terms of number of records for that value, the one listed first is going to be the one that is returned by the mode function. I've got a schedule that shows the change in the number of jobs in the economy for the United States from the years 2002 through half of 2012. And like with the average function, I can use AutoSum to determine the maximum or the minimum. That's the maximum. I can also use it for the minimum. Control Enter, F2, and I'm going to have to adjust this a bit because AutoSum will pick up all the numbers that are either above or to the left of the cell you're entering the AutoSum, or in this case, the AutoMin function into. I obviously don't want Q18, so I'm going to change the range to end at P18, and I certainly don't want D18, which is the year. I want E18. Enter. And with AutoSum's help, double-clicking to fill, I've got the maximum and the minimum jobs that were added or subtracted from the U.S. economy in each of the different years. So those are the fundamental statistical functions. We started with the count, countif, and countifs function, where we can count the number of numbers in a range, count the non-blank cells that meet some criteria or multiple criteria. We use count A and count blank to count the non-blank cells and to count the blank cells. We looked at the average, average if, and average if-s function, where we could get the arithmetic mean for a range of numbers, and we can also get the arithmetic mean for a range of numbers based on some criteria and even multiple criteria. And then we looked at the median and the mode function, where we could get the number that's in the middle of a range of numbers or the number that's most common in a range of numbers. And finally, we looked at the max and min function that gives us the maximum value in a range and the minimum value in a range.